In 2007, the BBC performed a study that originated back in the 1960s. For a long time, this experiment was considered inhumane. Subjects were placed alone in soundproof bunkers for 48 hours. For the entirety of their stay, there was no light, no sound, and no interaction with anyone or anything. With the exception of the feeling of a bed and a floor underneath them, their stimulation for 2 whole days was virtually zero. Towards the end of their stay, they began to hallucinate and see things that weren't there.
See a pile of oyster shells, like 5,000 oyster shells in a pile. Oh God! Just go and touch it. It's gone.
Now, no video game is going to give you an experience like the subjects of this experiment had, and no game should. I mention this study because I think it best illustrates how reducing someone's exposure to audiovisual information can affect them. And although no game can take a player to this extreme, a lot of them do dial down the level of stimulation provided quite a bit in order to create memorable moments, give you a feeling, or simply allow you to reflect. But when colors dim, music fades, and our senses slow down, what is actually happening in our minds? And is it similar to what happened to the minds of the subjects in this study? So, in this episode of Psych of Play, I want to try and answer those questions by exploring how video games toy with their levels of stimulation, and how in some cases, less information is more. Up front, we should establish that video games rely primarily on 2 forms of information: visual and auditory. The vibrant colors of Mario Kart pop off the screen and give you a feeling of a heart-pounding and wacky race, whereas the dark palette of Limbo brings you into a world of decay and mystery. Low-energy music generally makes you feel contemplative or relaxed, whereas upbeat or dramatic soundtracks increase the intensity of some moments. I think this much is obvious. Boss fight music, for example, tends to be highly stimulating and rich with complexity. But I have always been more captivated by the moments leading up to a boss, not because of the soundtrack, but because of the lack thereof. Take, for example, Majora's Mask. The tracks that play as you tussle with Majora's different forms are bizarre, upbeat, and sinister, which complement the setting and give you a sense that you're sparring with an otherworldly power. This is a higher state of stimulation, and you see a similar level of chaos shortly before this in the scene where the mask goes rogue. The music here is high tempo and makes you sweat just a bit. However, when you chase the mask, you are transported to a peaceful hill, a stark contrast to the hectic bantering from the previous scene. There is no music. The only sounds you hear are Link's footsteps and some atmospheric noise like birds chirping. The scene is quiet and invites the player to take a breather and think about what has happened and what is going to happen. That quick transition or drop from a high sensory input to a low sensory input catches the player off guard and sort of gives you a chance for your mind to catch up to the flurry of information it just received, and it expands the moment. This is something that I like to call the dip effect. You see it in movie trailers a lot whenever you hear this. And even sometimes in game trailers whenever you hear this. We even see this in Pokemon Gold and Silver when the foreboding soundtrack cuts out before confronting the champ and you read his pre-match dialogue in silence. All these examples show how removing strong audio cues draws your attention in close or creates a feeling of finality, leading you to say to yourself, "This is it." But the dip effect isn't just restricted to sound, it can be just as effective with visuals. When Shovel Knight enters the final hallway to the Enchantress, the soundtrack doesn't change much, but there's almost nothing going on in the background. It's pitch black save for a few ominous candles, which is very different from earlier, more vibrant levels. Instead of blasting more information at you, Shovel Knight reduces the level of visual input, which gives you a chance to catch up and reminisce about the adventure that has led you to this moment. And games aren't limited to reducing one cue at a time. The corridor to Dandara's final boss drops both the music and the colorful backdrop in favor of a pitch black room with hidden street lamps. In Twilight Princess, the final stairway of Hyrule Castle is stuffed with thrilling enemies, obstacles, and a rising orchestral movement. But all three give way to a dreary, hushed area outside the castle that you'll come across before your showdown with Ganon. But what makes the dip effect work? Why would a sudden drop in sensory inputs encourage a player to reflect or catch up on what has already happened? To understand that, we're going to play a little game. I'm going to show you 14 words back to back at 2-second intervals. And it's your job to memorize as many as you can within the time limit. At the end, you'll write down every word you can remember. Or you can just recite them out loud if you don't feel like getting paper. But you can't pause the video while the words are on screen, so just do the best you can. Are you ready? Go. Okay, all done. Go ahead and hit pause to write down or recite your answers and then come back. Here are all of the words presented in order of when they were presented. How did you do? Some performed better than others, obviously, but more than likely, most of you remembered sport and onion, which coincidentally are the first and last words presented. Well, not exactly coincidentally. This is an age-old test that demonstrates something called the primacy and recency effects. The primacy effect has to do with long-term memory. You remember sport because of its position in the list. Since it's first, when you see it, your mind is fresh. It's the only thing you're trying to memorize. Your mind is less cluttered, and you can more easily rehearse it. Sport, sport, sport. Okay, I think I got it, sport. But as more words are added, this becomes a bit harder. Sport panda would train, sport panda would train. Without breaks in between data, it's hard to internalize any information, let alone single words. So when given this test, people tend to remember the very first words because it actually got stored to long-term memory. On the other hand, the recency effect comes from your short-term memory, or your working memory, which typically lasts a few seconds. Since onion was at the very end, it was fresh on the brain, and so you immediately wrote it down when you were prompted for your answers to keep from losing it. This is why people typically remember the last bit of information on a list like this. What makes this so brilliant is that we can use primacy and recency to our advantage if we want someone to remember something. Teachers, especially those in elementary schools, will often break up their lessons into chunks with definite beginnings and ends, and then place slower interactive activities in between. By doing so, they take one large lesson with one beginning and one end, and create several more digestible chunks of information with numerous starts and stops along the way. And according to primacy and recency, a lot more of the lesson is going to be retained here than through your dry hour-and-a-half political science lecture, with one beginning that can't end soon enough. Why do you think I break these episodes up into activities in multiple sections by fading to black and changing the music? I want you to remember what you watched, so that you can go show your friends. So the dip effect that I mentioned earlier is not actually an established thing. It's just a name that I gave to the break in between recency and primacy, and more specifically, what that gap does in a video game. It gives you a chance to catch up, internalize, and really appreciate everything that's happened to you since the last time the level of stimulation was low, or the last break. And that's definitely why we see it a lot before boss fights. Developers want the gameplay at the end of the last section and the boss that is at the beginning of the next section to be memorable. But we've only talked about boss fights. If we expand this knowledge to entire games, I think there's a lot more to be learned. One of the most important factors in a game is its pacing, and I think this is wound together tightly with primacy and recency. Games with fantastic pacing like Uncharted 2 or Inside typically follow the teacher model from earlier and break their action into well-defined chunks with low-intensity gameplay in between. If Vanquish, with its non-stop action, is the longer and less varied lecture, Shadow of the Colossus is the first-grade teacher who complements bite-sized, rigorous lessons with low-energy activities. Each Colossus encounter is highly stimulating and boasts incredible visuals, challenging gameplay, and one of the most engaging scores of our time. But head developer Fumito Ueda was careful to ensure that the soundtrack cuts out between fights when you are traveling, and that there is very little in the world to distract you from reflecting on what you've done and what lies ahead. By separating each Colossus and giving you breaks in between, the gritty details from the beginning and end of each individual fight are more likely to stick with you. The same goes for the action sequences in Uncharted 2, where each high-intensity section is bookended by quiet puzzle solving or exploration. 2016's Inside is no different. Early in the game, you'll make a heart-pounding escape from some dangerous men with dogs. Then you'll come across some low-energy puzzle solving in a barn. Shortly after, you'll be attacked by a zombified pig and then immediately be relieved by some odd but slower tempo obstacles. Pacing is absolutely about variety, but on a cognitive level, I think it's also about giving the player a chance to process what's happened, so that afterwards they'll be eager to lean in for more. To wrap up, I want to pause on Inside for a moment and focus on something interesting that this game does. Although the pacing is great, developer Playdead never overloads your senses with information. Uncharted is paced just as well, if not better, but its highs and lows are on average much higher. The action sequences are way over the top, and the quieter bits are still really striking from a visual standpoint. So if we graphed out its stimulation throughout the story, it might look something like this. In contrast, Inside is dreary. There is very little color, and its minimalistic soundtrack gives your mind much less to focus on. Although it does have its ebb and flow in action, this game's stimulation on a graph might look a little more like this. Primacy and recency aside, the overall level of sensory information from Inside is just much lower on average. Whereas a pre-boss corridor might reduce the color and sound to make you reflect for a moment, Inside invites you to reflect throughout the entire game, and I think that's what makes it so compelling. Colorful visuals and soundtracks help tell a story, but Inside's lack thereof allows your mind to create a story. It's why this game's meaning is so commonly debated. So little is known about this world because so little information is provided. And when your mind is unoccupied, it can fill in the blanks any way it likes. It can speculate or imagine what might be going on in this wasteland. The brain is always ticking, even when there is less food for it to chew on, even when there is no food for it to chew on. So you can imagine that if you starve it for, say, 48 hours with no input or stimulation, and it wants to process something, eventually, it might snap. The mind might begin to create things to process. It might begin to hallucinate. And according to Professor Ian Robbins, the trauma specialist at St. George's Hospital in London, this is exactly what many hallucinations are. Robbins was the lead psychologist on the total isolation study from earlier, and after viewing the footage on the subjects, he stated that even in the absence of information, the human brain carries on working and processing information, even if there is none to process. And after a while, it begins to create that information. Now, of course, Inside isn't going to make you hear voices or send you into a trip, but your mind will fill in the blanks that it provides because of the same reason that these volunteers hallucinated. The mind wants stimulation and will speculate, improvise, or theorize when there isn't much available. When you whet its appetite with a small opening course, it's going to savor every little bite that it has. Whereas if you give it a buffet, it overeats and gets really full really fast. And of course, if you starve it entirely, it'll get angry and then start making things up. Like that weird scene in The Secret Life of Pets. I think the best way to sum all this up is that video games operate on a scale from boring all the way up to too much at one time. A good game will shift back and forth between the two without ever hitting an extreme. Inside works because it rides very closely to the line of boring without ever actually getting there. So the player wants more info, doesn't get it, and then fills in the blanks because they're already way too intrigued to just not think about it. Additionally, when your game slows down after a good chunk of thrilling content, you give the player a chance to breathe and process what just happened. By using the primacy and recency effect, you can reinforce those jaw-dropping and awe-inspiring moments in your game, and ensure that they are remembered for a long, long time. Hey, thank you so much for watching. This one was fun but tough, a real challenge to write. It took longer than I expected, and to be honest, it kind of kicked my butt. But when I see the feedback on these videos, it genuinely does make it worth it. So whether you love my work or don't, I deeply appreciate the time, the interaction, and the opinions that you all consistently share. I hope to be doing this for a long time, and I'd love to have you along for the ride. So thank you again, take care of yourself, and I will see you next time.